The corridors of the Galactic Naval Academy buzzed with the controlled chaos of another training cycle beginning. Alien cadets from dozens of species moved through the pristine halls, their conversations creating a symphony of clicks, hisses, and melodic tones that had become as familiar as breathing to those who called this place home. Zektar adjusted his ceremonial sash, the purple fabric marking him as a third-year cadet from the prestigious Veltar system. His scaled hide gleamed under the artificial lighting, each plate polished to perfection as befitted someone of his standing. At nearly 8 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could tear through metal, he commanded respect wherever he walked. His species, the Veltari, had been instrumental in founding the Galactic Council 3 centuries ago, and their military prowess was legendary throughout known space. Behind him walked his usual entourage of admirers and fellow Veltari cadets, their conversation peppered with casual arrogance about their upcoming tactical exercises. They spoke in their native tongue, secure in the knowledge that few other species had mastered their complex language. The human delegation arrives today, Thexon remarked, his mandibles clicking with amusement. I heard they're sending actual cadets this time, not just observers. Zektar's laugh was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. Humans. The Council's latest charity case. I've read their files, they've barely mastered interplanetary travel, let alone the complexities of galactic warfare. It's almost insulting that the Academy is pretending to take them seriously. The group rounded a corner, entering one of the main thoroughfares where cadets typically gathered between classes. Here, representatives from every major species mingled, creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. The crystalline Zephyrians caught light and threw rainbows across nearby walls, while the gaseous nebulae entities drifted in their containment suits, their forms shifting like living clouds. It was here that Zektar first noticed the disturbance. Near the great viewing windows that offered a breathtaking view of the Academy's orbital position around the gas giant Kepler Prime, a small crowd had gathered. Raised voices carried across the space, though most cadets seemed content to observe from a distance rather than intervene. Curiosity piqued, Zektar approached, his group following like loyal hounds. What he saw made him pause in surprise. A human cadet, the first he'd seen in person, stood pressed against the reinforced transparasteel of the viewing window. The alien was smaller than Zektar had expected, barely reaching his chest in height, with the pale skin and fine features that marked his species as almost fragile by galactic standards. Short brown hair topped a face that looked young even by human standards, and the standard Academy uniform hung loose on his slight frame. Surrounding him were 3 cadets Zektar recognized immediately. Korthon, a Brutak warrior whose species prided themselves on physical dominance, loomed over the human like a living mountain. His rocky, granite-like skin was scarred from countless battles, and his forearms were currently positioned to prevent any escape. Beside him stood YSSIRA, a serpentis whose coiled lower body and venomous fangs had made her species feared assassins for millennia. The third was Quintel, an insectoid hivemind whose compound eyes reflected the scene in dozens of faceted images. You don't belong here, soft skin, Korthon was saying, his voice like grinding stone. Your species is barely out of their caves. What makes you think you can stand alongside real warriors? The human, Marcus Chen, according to the name tape on his uniform, kept his hands raised peacefully, but his voice was steady. I earned my place here just like everyone else. The Academy accepted Earth's application. The Academy made a mistake, YSSIRA interjected, her forked tongue flicking out to taste his fear. You're a curiosity, nothing more. A primitive species playing at being civilized. Quintel's mandibles clacked in agreement. The hivemind consensus agrees. Your people lack the necessary evolution for advanced warfare. You should return to your dirt planet before you embarrass yourselves further. Zektar found himself oddly fascinated by the scene. Part of him agreed with the 3 antagonists. Humans were clearly outclassed by virtually every other species in the Academy. Their technology was primitive, their physical capabilities laughable, and their military history consisted mainly of fighting amongst themselves with crude weapons. But there was something in the human's demeanor that intrigued him. Where most beings would have cowered before 3 of the galaxy's most feared warrior species, this Marcuschan stood his ground with quiet dignity. I understand you have concerns, Marcus said carefully, never breaking eye contact with Korthon despite the significant height difference. But I'm here to learn, just like all of you. Maybe we can. He never finished the sentence. Korthon's primary arm shot forward in a blur of motion, clearly intending to slam the human against the window with enough force to crack ribs. It was a classic Brutak intimidation move, designed to establish dominance without causing permanent damage, though with their species' strength, the line was often thin.
But the blow never landed.
A new hand appeared in the space between Corthon's massive fist and Marcus's chest. The intervention was so sudden, so unexpected, that for a moment everyone simply stared in confusion. The hand was small, pale, and belonged to another human, but this one was female, with long dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail and green eyes that blazed with controlled fury. She had appeared out of nowhere, moving with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for her species. Her uniform was identical to Marcus's, but she wore it with a confidence that immediately commanded attention.
More importantly, she had somehow positioned herself perfectly to intercept Corthon's strike without seeming to exert any effort whatsoever.
The Brutak warrior stared down at his captured fist in bewilderment. His kind could punch through solid rock, yet this slip of a girl had stopped his blow as easily as catching a floating feather. His other three arms tensed, ready to continue the confrontation, but something in her expression gave him pause. "That's enough," she said simply, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. Her accent was different from Marcus's, with clipped, precise tones that suggested military training.
"Step back. Now." Corthon's pride warred with confusion.
"Who dares?" I said, "step back." Her grip on his fist tightened slightly, and Zektar could see the muscles in her forearm cord with tension. "You're outnumbered 3-1, attacking an unarmed cadet, and creating a public disturbance."
"That makes you the problem here, not him." Another soft skin, YSSIRA hissed, her hood flaring wide in a threat display.
"Two primitives won't change the mathematics of this situation." The human girl's eyes flicked to the Serpentis without releasing Corthon's fist.
"You're assuming we're primitives.
That's your first mistake." She looked back at the Brutak warrior.
"This is your last chance to walk away with your dignity intact."
The crowd around them had grown larger, cadets from a dozen species drawn by the commotion. Zektar noticed that many of them seemed as surprised as he was by the human girl's intervention. Humans were supposed to be weak, slow, and cowardly according to every briefing he'd received. Yet here was one who had not only inserted herself into a dangerous situation but seemed genuinely confident in her ability to handle it.
"Last chance for what?" Corthon rumbled, genuine curiosity now mixing with his anger. "You think you can fight all three of us?" "I think," the girl said calmly, "that you're about to learn why Earth's application to the Academy included detailed combat footage."
With that, she released his fist and took a single step backward, placing herself squarely between Marcus and his three antagonists. Her stance was loose, relaxed, but Zektar's trained eye caught the subtle positioning that suggested extensive martial arts training. Her weight was balanced on the balls of her feet, ready to move in any direction, and her hands were held at her sides in a deceptively casual position that could become defensive blocks or offensive strikes in milliseconds. "Captain Sarah Williams," Marcus said quietly, recognition and relief clear in his voice.
"I didn't know you were already aboard." "Captain?" Quintel's compound eyes fixed on the rank insignia barely visible on Sarah's collar. "Impossible. No human could achieve captain rank in any legitimate military organization." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal. "That depends on your definition of legitimate."
"I graduated from the Terra Military Academy at 16, earned my commission in the Solar Defense Force at 18, and commanded my own vessel in the Titan conflict before my 20th birthday. The Academy reviewed my credentials and found them satisfactory." She paused, her gaze moving from one antagonist to the next. "The question is whether you three are going to accept that and move along, or if I need to provide a practical demonstration of why the Academy was impressed." The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Zektar found himself leaning forward, genuinely curious about how this would unfold. Everything he knew about humans suggested they should be completely outmatched in any physical confrontation with galactic species. Yet this Sarah Williams stood there as if she were facing down unruly children rather than three of the most dangerous warrior species in known space. Corthon flexed all four of his massive arms, his rocky hide scraping audibly as the plates shifted. "You think your primitive fighting styles can match Brutak combat techniques? We have been perfecting warfare for 10,000 years while your species was still learning to make fire." "Interesting perspective," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining that same unnaturally calm tone. "Tell me, in those 10,000 years, how many species did you face that fought like humans?" The question seemed to catch the Brutak off guard. His massive head tilted slightly as he considered it. "None. Your species is unique in its limitations." "Exactly."
Sarah's smile widened slightly. You've spent millennia perfecting techniques to fight other Brutax, other Serpentis, other hive minds.
All species that follow predictable patterns, with known strengths and weaknesses.
But you've never fought humans. You don't know our patterns. You don't understand our capabilities.
And that, my oversized friend, is what we call a tactical disadvantage.
YSSARA's hood flared wider, her fangs extending to their full length. Enough talk. Serpentis strike fast and, without warning.
Your reaction time won't. She never finished the sentence because she was suddenly on the ground. The movement was so quick that most of the watching cadets missed it entirely. One moment YSSIRA was coiled and ready to strike, the next she was sprawled across the deck plating with Sarah standing over her, apparently having moved 3 feet to the side without anyone seeing how. The Serpentis writhed, trying to understand what had happened, her hand pressed against her throat where some kind of nerve strike had temporarily paralyzed her vocal cords. Serpentis anatomy, Sarah explained conversationally to the stunned crowd, as if she were giving a lecture rather than having just disabled a lethal opponent. Your nervous system is incredibly sophisticated, but it has a critical vulnerability right here. She pointed to the exact spot she had struck, where the primary neural pathway connects to your vocal and motor functions. Apply pressure correctly, and you get temporary paralysis without permanent damage.
Very useful for non-lethal takedowns.
The silence stretched for several heartbeats as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Then, Quintel began to move, his compound eyes tracking Sarah's position as he calculated attack vectors with hive mind precision. Insects, Sarah said, not even bothering to look at him directly, rely on pheromone communication and collective intelligence. Disrupt the pheromone receptors. Her hand moved in a blur, striking 3 precise points on Quintel's carapace in rapid succession, and you temporarily sever the connection to the hive mind. Without that collective intelligence, they're just oversized bugs with excellent reflexes but poor individual judgment. Quintel staggered, his mandibles clicking frantically as he tried to re-establish his connection to the greater hive consciousness. His movements became erratic, confused, as his individual mind struggled to process tactical information without the support system he had relied on since birth.
That left Korthon.
The massive Brutac warrior stared down at his 2 defeated companions, then back at Sarah, who had somehow neutralized 2 opponents without breaking a sweat or even raising her heart rate noticeably. His forearms spread wide in a combat stance that had been refined over millennia of warfare. Impressive, he admitted, his rocky voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. But Brutacs are not so easily defeated as snakes and bugs.
We are living stone, shaped by endless conflict.
Your tricks won't work on us.
Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right.
Brutacs are incredibly resilient, and your species' combat experience is genuinely impressive. Traditional pressure point attacks would be useless against your rock-like hide, and your redundant organ systems make you nearly impossible to disable quickly. She paused, her green eyes studying his massive form with professional interest.
Fortunately, I don't need to disable you quickly. What do you mean?
I mean that while your species has been perfecting warfare for 10,000 years, mine has been perfecting something you've never had to master.
Sarah's stance shifted slightly, becoming something that Zektar couldn't quite identify. It looked almost like she was preparing to dance rather than fight. Endurance hunting. Endurance hunting? Humans are pursuit predators, Korthon. We don't kill our prey by overpowering them. We kill them by never giving up. We chase them across continents, across seasons, across years if necessary. We don't stop, we don't tire, and we never, ever quit. Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the entire gathering. So here's what's going to happen.
You're going to attack me with everything you have, all 4 arms, all your strength, all your 10,000 years of combat experience.
And I'm going to avoid it.
Then, you're going to attack again, and I'll avoid that too.
We'll keep doing this until you're exhausted, frustrated, and completely demoralized.
Then, when you can barely lift your arms, I'll walk over and gently push you down. And everyone here will understand exactly why Earth was invited to join this academy.
The challenge hung in the air like a living thing.
Around them, the crowd of watching cadets had grown to include nearly 100 beings from dozens of species, all drawn by the unprecedented sight of humans not only standing up to established galactic powers but apparently winning. Zektar found his respect for the species rising despite himself. This Sarah Williams might be physically small and technologically primitive, but her tactical thinking was genuinely impressive. She had identified and exploited her opponent's weaknesses while simultaneously playing to humanity's strengths. It was exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that separated good officers from great ones. Corthon's attack, when it came, was everything Sarah had predicted. Her massive arms moved in perfect coordination, each strike capable of pulverizing bone, creating a devastating pattern that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer volume and power.
But Sarah wasn't there.
She flowed around his attacks like water around stone, never quite where his fists expected her to be. Her movements were economical, efficient, wasting no energy on flashy dodges or unnecessary acrobatics. Instead, she gave ground when pressure was applied, redirected force when possible, and always stayed just out of reach. The Brutak's second attack was faster, more focused, as he began to adapt to her movement patterns. But adaptation took energy, and energy was exactly what Sarah was forcing him to spend. She continued her deadly dance, occasionally reaching out to tap his arms or shoulders, not to cause damage, but to remind him that she could touch him whenever she chose. By the fifth exchange, Corthon's breathing had become labored.
His species was built for short, decisive conflicts where superior strength and durability could overwhelm opponents quickly.
Extended combat was not their forte, and Sarah was forcing him into exactly the kind of prolonged engagement that favored her species' evolutionary advantages. Getting tired, she asked conversationally as she ducked under a particularly wild swing.
"We can stop any time you want."
The Brutak's only response was a frustrated roar as he poured more energy into his attacks. But fatigue was making him sloppy, and sloppiness was making him predictable. Sarah began to close the distance slightly, no longer content to simply avoid his strikes but beginning to position herself for the eventual conclusion of their engagement. It came sooner than even she had expected. Corthon, desperate to end the fight quickly, committed too much of his weight to a powerful forearm combination that would have been devastating if it had connected. Instead, Sarah stepped inside his guard, placed her palm gently against his chest, and pushed. The massive warrior toppled backward like a felled tree, his own momentum and exhaustion doing most of the work. He hit the deck with a sound like breaking rock, and lay there for several moments, chest heaving as he struggled to process what had just happened.
Sarah looked down at him with something that might have been sympathy.
"Your species has an impressive military tradition," she said sincerely. "But you've been fighting the same kinds of enemies for so long that you've forgotten how to adapt to new challenges."
"That's not a criticism, it's just an observation."
She turned to address the watching crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence.
"My name is Captain Sarah Williams, and this is Cadet Marcus Chen.
We're humans from Earth, and we're here because the Galactic Council recognized that our species brings unique capabilities to the table. Not better capabilities, different ones.
We don't expect special treatment, and we don't want anyone's pity.
We just want the same chance to prove ourselves that every other species has been given." Her gaze found Zektar in the crowd, and, for a moment their eyes met. He saw intelligence there, and determination, but also something he hadn't expected, hope. Not just hope for her own success, but hope for what cooperation between species might accomplish. "The galaxy is a dangerous place," she continued, helping YSSRA to her feet as the Serpentis' paralysis began to wear off. "The Devourers are still out there, the void touched grows stronger every year, and there are threats we haven't even discovered yet.
Humanity isn't asking to lead anyone. We're asking to help.
To bring our unique perspective to challenges that have stymied the Council for centuries." Quintel had managed to re-establish his connection to the hive mind, and his compound eyes were now fixed on Sarah with something approaching awe. "The hive mind consensus has shifted," he admitted, his mandibles clicking in what might have been embarrassment.
"We had not considered the tactical applications of endurance hunting."
Corthon struggled to his feet, accepting Marcus's offered hand despite the vast difference in their sizes.
"You fought with honor," he said simply.
"I misjudged your species."
"We all make mistakes," Sarah replied diplomatically.
"The important thing is learning from them." As the crowd began to disperse, cadets from various species approaching the humans with newfound curiosity rather than contempt, Zektar found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about Earth's newest representatives. Perhaps there was more to humanity than primitive technology and physical limitations. Perhaps their greatest strength wasn't in their bodies or their machines, but in their minds, their ability to think differently, to approach problems from angles that no other species had considered. The first day of humanity's integration into the Galactic Naval Academy had certainly been more interesting than anyone had expected. And, if this small display was any indication of what humans could accomplish when properly motivated, then, perhaps the Council had made a wiser choice than even they realized. As Sarah and Marcus walked away together, their conversation carrying clearly in the aftermath of the confrontation, Zektar heard something that made him smile despite himself.
Next time, Marcus was saying, maybe we could try the diplomatic approach first? Sarah's laugh was clear and bright. Where would be the fun in that?
Yes, Zektar decided, humanity's presence at the Academy was going to be very interesting indeed. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the main corridor, and word of humanity's arrival had spread throughout the Academy like wildfire. Every species had their own version of events, with details growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the human female had defeated 20 opponents single-handedly, while others insisted she had used some form of psychic manipulation to achieve victory. The truth, as it often was, proved more interesting than the fiction. Commander Veltarkes stood before the assembled faculty in the Academy's primary briefing chamber, his tentacle form rippling with what his species expressed as deep consideration. As the Academy's Director of Strategic Studies, he had seen countless species integrate into galactic society over his 2-century career, but none quite like humanity. The psychological evaluation reports are unusual, he was saying to the gathered professors and department heads. His voice carried the harmonic undertones that made Zalithian speech sound like distant music.
The humans demonstrate stress responses unlike any we've catalogued.
Where most species show elevated aggression or withdrawal when placed in hostile environments, they appear to become more cooperative and resourceful. Professor Thanak, a crystalline Zephyrian whose form caught and refracted the chamber's lighting into dancing rainbows, chimed in harmonious disagreement.
Cooperation born of desperation, perhaps. They understand they're outclassed in virtually every measurable category.
Their behavior could simply be adaptive survival strategy.
That was my initial assessment as well, Kes admitted, his tentacles shifting to display academic uncertainty. However, the results from their first tactical simulation have forced me to reconsider.
The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional representation of the Academy's most challenging wargame scenario. Known as the Gordian Complex, it was a no-win situation designed to test cadet responses to impossible odds. Over the past 50 years, only 12 species had managed to achieve even partial success, and none had ever actually won. The scenario places a mixed-species cadet team in command of a severely damaged cruiser, Kes continued, manipulating the display to show various tactical elements. They're outnumbered 20-1, operating with 40% power, and facing 3 different enemy fleets with conflicting objectives. Standard Academy doctrine suggests 14 different approaches, all of which result in honorable defeat with minimal casualties. The assembled faculty had seen this briefing dozens of times, but they watched with professional attention as the simulation played out its familiar patterns. Most cadet teams lasted between 47 minutes and 2 hours before being forced to surrender or face total annihilation. The human team lasted 17 hours. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Several faculty members made sounds of disbelief, while others leaned forward in their seats as if proximity might help them better understand what they had heard.
17 hours, Professor Thanek repeated, her crystalline form dimming with what might have been confusion.
That's impossible. No team has ever lasted beyond 3 hours. The mathematical limitations of the scenario prevent it.
I thought so as well, Kes replied, his tentacles now displaying what humans might recognize as amused satisfaction.
I ran the simulation 6 times, convinced there was a malfunction. But, each time, the results were consistent. The humans didn't just survive 17 hours, they actually began to win. The display shifted, showing a complex tactical situation that looked more like a 3-dimensional chess match than a traditional space battle. Ships moved in seemingly impossible patterns, resources appeared where none should have existed, and enemy fleets found themselves engaged in conflicts with each other rather than with the human-led force.
How?
The question came from Admiral Krextor, a Veltari whose presence commanded instant attention from everyone in the chamber. His scaled hide bore the scars of actual combat, marking him as one of the few faculty members who had served in the Devourer Wars.
What strategy did they employ?
That's what makes this so fascinating, Kes replied, adjusting the display to show the tactical progression minute by minute.
They didn't employ any single strategy. They improvised. Constantly.
They would pursue one tactical approach until the enemy adapted, then immediately shift to something completely different. By the 7th hour, they were using techniques I've never seen in 3 centuries of military service. The display showed a crucial moment where the damaged human cruiser had somehow convinced 2 of the enemy fleets that the third was planning to betray them both. Within minutes, what had been a coordinated assault on the human position had devolved into a 3-way battle that the humans watched from a safe distance while conducting repairs. Social engineering, Admiral Krextor observed, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. They turned the enemy's strength against itself through misdirection and manipulation. More than that, Kess corrected. Watch this sequence from Hour 12. The display shifted again, showing the human team coordinating with what appeared to be a civilian merchant convoy that had wandered into the battle zone. Within minutes, the merchant ships had been converted into improvised weapons platforms, their cargo holds turned into missile launchers, and their communication arrays repurposed for electronic warfare. They weaponized everything, Professor Yathara noted, her insectoid eyes tracking the complex maneuvers with hive-mind precision. Every piece of debris, every system failure, every apparent disadvantage became a tactical asset. The merchant convoy was particularly impressive, Cass agreed. The humans convinced the traders that participating in the battle would be profitable in the long term, then taught them basic combat maneuvers using their own cargo as ammunition. By Hour 15, they had essentially created a 4th fleet out of nothing. Admiral Krextor's scarred features showed something that might have been respect. And, at Hour 17? They achieved total victory. All enemy fleets destroyed or surrendered, minimal casualties among their own forces, and they had somehow managed to capture enough enemy equipment to repair their cruiser and upgrade it beyond its original specifications. Kess paused, his tentacles displaying what humans would recognize as deep puzzlement. According to our simulations, what they accomplished should have been mathematically impossible. Unless, Professor Thanek said slowly, her crystalline form brightening with sudden understanding, the parameters of impossibility don't apply to their species the same way they apply to ours. The implications of that statement settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Every species in the galaxy operated under certain understood limitations, physical, technological, and psychological boundaries that defined what was possible and what was not. The Academy's training programs were built around those limitations, designed to push cadets to their maximum potential while acknowledging the absolute boundaries of their capabilities. But what if humanity simply didn't recognize those boundaries? There's more, Kess continued, calling up a new set of data. The individual psychological profiles from the simulation are equally fascinating. While other species showed standard stress responses to impossible odds, elevated aggression in warrior species, withdrawal in more peaceful ones, rigid adherence to doctrine in military cultures, the humans showed something completely different. The display now showed brain scan data from the human cadets during various points in the simulation. Where most species would show either fight or flight responses or complete shutdown when faced with overwhelming odds, the human scans revealed patterns that looked almost like meditation mixed with intense creativity. Their stress response appears to enhance problem-solving capabilities rather than diminish them, Kess explained. The worse their situation became, the more innovative their solutions grew. By Hour 10, they were operating at cognitive levels that should have been impossible to maintain under combat conditions. Admiral Krextor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Have we considered the possibility that this is exactly why the Council approved their membership? Not despite their primitive technology or unusual physiology, but because of it? The Devourer Wars, Professor Yathara said suddenly, her compound eyes focusing on some internal calculation. The hive mind has been analyzing the tactical reports from the final battles. Traditional strategies were failing across all fronts until the irregulars began achieving impossible victories, Krextor finished, his voice heavy with memory. Small units operating beyond normal parameters, accomplishing objectives that full fleets couldn't achieve. The chamber fell silent as the implications began to sink in. The Devourer Wars had ended 3 decades ago, but the scars they left on galactic civilization were still healing. The enemy had been unlike anything the Council had ever faced, beings that consumed not just matter and energy, but information itself, growing stronger with every victory and adapting to counter every strategy employed against them. Traditional military doctrine had proved worse than useless. Every standard tactic, every established strategy, every proven technique had been absorbed and turned against the defenders. Victory had come only when desperate commanders began authorizing operations that violated every principle of sound military planning, the kind of chaotic, improvisational warfare that drove tactical computers insane and made veteran officers weep with frustration.
The Council has been preparing for their return, Krextor said quietly.
Intelligence suggests the Devourers weren't destroyed, merely delayed. When they come back, they'll have adapted to counter every strategy we used against them before.
Traditional warfare will be even less effective than it was the first time.
But humans don't use traditional warfare, Professor Thanek observed, her crystalline form now pulsing with what might have been excitement.
They don't follow established patterns or accept recognized limitations. They might be exactly what we need. Or, Professor Ythera added with insectoid pragmatism, they might represent a completely new kind of threat. A species that doesn't recognize boundaries could be as dangerous to us as to any enemy.
The debate continued for another hour, but, even as the faculty argued the merits and dangers of humanity's integration, events were already unfolding elsewhere in the Academy that would prove their concerns both justified and incomplete. In Training Bay 7, Marcus Chen was struggling with what should have been a simple marksmanship exercise.
The weapon he held was a standard plasma rifle used throughout the galaxy, its design perfected over millennia of warfare. For most species, achieving basic proficiency required perhaps a week of practice.
Marcus had been working with it for 3 weeks and was still missing targets that should have been impossible to avoid.
His frustration was evident as he lowered the weapon after another failed attempt.
Around him, cadets from a dozen species achieved perfect scores with casual ease, their natural abilities making the exercise look effortless. A few had begun making quiet comments about human inadequacy, though they were careful to keep their voices low after the corridor incident.
Problems with the weapon, soft skin? The voice belonged to Quintel, a hive-mind cadet who had been one of Sarah's opponents during their first encounter.
His tone was neutral, but there was genuine curiosity in his compound eyes. Marcus sighed, setting the plasma rifle on the nearby equipment rack. I can't seem to get the targeting system to work properly.
It's like it's calibrated for different physiology.
It is, Quintel replied matter-of-factly. Galactic standard weapons are designed for optimal efficiency with Veltari nervous systems. Most other species have adapted their techniques to compensate for the differences.
How long did that take? For most species? Generations.
The Serpentis required nearly 2 centuries to develop effective marksmanship with plasma weapons. The Brutax have never truly mastered them, they prefer weapons that don't require precision. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then did something that surprised both himself and Quintel. Instead of picking up the plasma rifle again, he walked over to the weapons locker and began examining other options. Most cadets stuck with galactic standard equipment, but the Academy maintained a collection of weapons from various species for specialized training.
What are you doing? Quintel asked, his hive-mind connection apparently as puzzled as he was.
Adapting, Marcus replied, hefting a kinetic projectile weapon from the Terran Defense Force's early military history.
If the plasma rifle doesn't work with human physiology, maybe I should use something that does.
The weapon he selected would have been considered primitive by galactic standards, a chemical propellant system that fired solid metal projectiles using controlled explosions. It had no sophisticated targeting computer, no plasma containment field, no advanced materials beyond hardened steel and polymer components. It felt perfect in his hands. His first shot struck the target dead center. His second shot hit the exact same spot. By his 10th shot, he was placing rounds with precision that made the watching cadets from other species stop their own exercises to stare.
That's impossible, someone whispered. Chemical projectile weapons can't achieve that kind of accuracy.
Marcus heard the comment and smiled. They can if you understand their limitations and work within them instead of trying to force them into someone else's parameters. Quintel approached the shooting station, his compound eyes studying both Marcus and the primitive weapon with new interest.
The hive mind is curious about your technique. Standard marksmanship doctrine for kinetic weapons was abandoned 3,000 years ago when plasma technology became available.
Standard doctrine was developed by species that had better options available, Marcus replied, taking careful aim at a target nearly twice the distance of the standard range. Humans developed our marksmanship techniques during a period when this was the best technology we had access to. We spent centuries perfecting the art of precision shooting with kinetic weapons. His shot rang out, and the distant target sprouted a hole exactly where the aiming point would have been.
Several cadets made sounds of disbelief.
The principles are different from plasma weapons, Marcus continued, warming to the subject as he always did when discussing technical details. Projectile drop, wind resistance, barrel harmonics, ammunition consistency, there are dozens of variables that affect accuracy, and mastering them requires a completely different mindset than point-and-click energy weapons.
But surely plasma technology is superior? Quintel pressed, his hive mind evidently fascinated by this unexpected revelation.
Energy weapons have no projectile drop, minimal environmental interference, virtually unlimited ammunition. In most situations, absolutely, Marcus agreed readily. But there are tactical scenarios where kinetic weapons have distinct advantages. They're harder to detect, impossible to trace back to the shooter, completely silent with the right ammunition, and they work regardless of electromagnetic interference or energy shielding. As if to demonstrate, he fired a shot at a target protected by a standard defensive shield generator. The plasma-stopping barrier was designed to absorb and dissipate energy weapons, but the solid metal projectile passed through it as if it weren't there. The shield didn't even register the impact, Quintel observed with something approaching awe.
Our defensive systems aren't calibrated to stop primitive projectiles.
They're not primitive, Marcus corrected gently. They're specialized. Every technology has its place, its optimal applications. The key is understanding when and how to use each tool effectively. Word of the demonstration spread through the Academy's cadet population with the same speed that news of Sarah's corridor victory had traveled. By evening mess, every cadet in Marcus's year had heard about the human who could achieve impossible accuracy with obsolete weapons. But it was what happened next that truly caught the attention of the faculty. During the following week's tactical exercise, a standard urban warfare scenario that most teams completed using established doctrine, Marcus requested permission to arm his squad with Terran kinetic weapons instead of galactic plasma rifles. The request was so unusual that it required approval from 3 different department heads, but eventually permission was granted largely out of curiosity about what would happen.
The results were unlike anything the Academy had ever recorded.
Where previous teams had taken between 4 and 8 hours to secure their objectives using conventional tactics, Marcus's squad achieved total success in 97 minutes. They moved through the urban environment like ghosts, their silent weapons allowing them to eliminate defenders without alerting nearby positions. When they encountered energy shields, they simply ignored them, firing through barriers that would have stopped any other force. More importantly, they achieved their success with 0 casualties among their own team and minimal damage to the urban infrastructure, something that had never been accomplished in the 50-year history of that particular exercise. The after-action review lasted 3 hours as faculty members tried to understand how basic Terran firearms had outperformed advanced galactic military technology in a scenario specifically designed to favor energy weapons and conventional tactics.
It's not the weapons, Commander Kess finally concluded, his tentacles displaying deep academic satisfaction. It's the mindset.
The humans approach the problem from a completely different philosophical foundation. Explain, Admiral Krextor commanded, his scarred features intense with concentration. Most galactic species developed energy weapons as improvements over kinetic projectiles, Kess explained. The technology progression was linear, they took existing concepts and made them better.
But humans spent centuries perfecting projectile weapons before they ever encountered energy technology.
Their tactical doctrine wasn't replaced by plasma weapons, it was developed independently.
Professor Thanek's crystalline form brightened with understanding. They're not using primitive technology as a substitute for advanced systems. They're using a completely different tactical framework that happens to employ kinetic projectiles. Exactly. And that framework includes concepts that were never integrated into galactic military doctrine because most species abandoned projectile weapons before fully exploring their potential. Admiral Krextor was quiet for a long moment, his veteran mind clearly working through the implications.
When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom.
The Devourers will be expecting us to fight them the same way we did before, only better.
Improved versions of the same weapons, refined tactics based on the same principles, more of what failed us the first time. He paused, his scarred features settling into something that might have been satisfaction.
They won't be expecting kinetic projectiles fired by species that think like humans.
There's something else, Kess added, calling up a new set of data on the chamber's holographic display. The psychological profiles from Marcus's team during the exercise show the same stress enhancement patterns we observed in Sarah's simulation. Under pressure, their problem-solving abilities increase rather than decrease.
The display showed brain scan data from the human cadets during various critical moments in the urban warfare scenario. Where other species would show elevated stress hormones and decreased cognitive function, the human showed what looked almost like enhanced creativity and improved decision-making. It's as if combat pressure activates something in their psychology that makes them more effective rather than less, Professor Yathera observed with hive-mind precision. Their species appears to have evolved for exactly this kind of high-stress tactical problem-solving. Which brings us back to the central question, Admiral Krextor said quietly. Did the Council approve humanity's membership because they needed another warrior species, or because they knew something was coming that would require a completely different approach to warfare? The question hung in the air unanswered, but, around the Academy, events continued to unfold that suggested the answer might be more complex than any of them had imagined. In training bays and tactical classrooms, simulation chambers and strategic planning sessions, human cadets were quietly revolutionizing the fundamental assumptions that had guided galactic military doctrine for millennia. And, somewhere in the deep void between the stars, ancient sensors detected the faint gravitational disturbances that suggested something vast and hungry was beginning to stir in the darkness where the Devourers had been sleeping for 30 years. The emergency klaxons began wailing at 0347 hours Galactic Standard Time, their harsh notes cutting through the usual quiet of the Academy's night cycle. In seconds, the pristine corridors filled with cadets from dozens of species, all moving with the disciplined urgency that marked them as future military officers. Sarah Williams was already fully dressed and moving toward her assigned emergency station before most of her dorm mates had fully awakened. 3 months at the Academy had taught her to sleep lightly and respond instantly to crisis alerts. Behind her, Marcus emerged from his quarters with the same rapid efficiency, both humans demonstrating the kind of instant readiness that had begun to mark their species as uniquely suited for military service. This isn't a drill, Marcus observed, noting the specific frequency and pattern of the alert signals as they made their way through corridors filled with organized chaos. These are actual combat station signals. Sarah nodded grimly. She had memorized every Academy protocol during her first week, a habit that had served her well throughout her military career. Question is whether it's an exercise designed to look real, or whether something's actually happening. They got their answer when they reached the main tactical center. The massive chamber was filled with senior faculty and upper-level cadets, all focused on the holographic displays that showed the Academy's orbital position around Kepler Prime. But it wasn't the usual peaceful scene of gas giant storms and civilian shipping lanes. Instead, the displays showed something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Ships. Hundreds of them, emerging from hyperspace in a coordinated formation that spoke of military precision and hostile intent. They were unlike any vessels in the Academy's recognition databases, dark, angular things that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their hulls covered in what looked like organic growth rather than manufactured armor. Devourer Advanced Scouts, Admiral Krextor was saying to the assembled command staff, his scarred features grim with recognition. Identical to the vessels we encountered at the Battle of Kepler Station 30 years ago. Intelligence was wrong, they weren't just delayed. They've been preparing. Commander Kess's tentacles rippled with what his species expressed as extreme agitation. The Academy's defensive systems are designed for training exercises and protection against pirates or raiders. We're not equipped to handle a full Devourer assault. Evacuation protocols, asked Professor Thanek, her crystalline form dimming with what might have been fear. Already initiated, Krextor replied. But it will take 6 hours to evacuate all personnel, and the Devourer fleet will reach weapons range in 4. We need to buy time. Sarah found herself studying the tactical display with the same intensity she had brought to every military problem she had ever encountered. The Devourer formation was textbook perfect, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support between vessel groups, approach vectors that minimized exposure to defensive installations. It was the kind of flawless execution that spoke of extensive planning and detailed intelligence about the Academy's capabilities. Permission to speak, Admiral, she said, stepping forward from the group of observing cadets. Krextor turned, his veteran eyes focusing on her with the kind of attention he reserved for potentially useful intelligence. Captain Williams. What's your assessment? They're not attacking, she said simply. Look at their formation, it's perfect for assault, but they're maintaining distance and conducting detailed scans. They're not here to destroy the Academy. They're here to study it. The statement sent a ripple of confused murmurs through the assembled officers. Professor Yathera's compound eyes fixed on the display, her hive-mind connection apparently reaching the same conclusion. The human is correct. Devourer combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming first strikes. This is reconnaissance behavior, not assault preparation. But why? Commander Kess asked, his harmonics carrying genuine puzzlement. The academy is a training facility. What could they learn here that would justify exposing themselves to our sensor arrays?
Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, seeing the same realization in his eyes that had just occurred to her.
They're studying the new integration programs.
They want to understand human military capabilities before we become a significant threat.
That's.
Krextor began, then stopped as the implications hit him.
They're not here for the academy. They're here for humanity.
The tactical display shifted as new data came in from the academy's sensor arrays. The Devourer vessels were indeed conducting intensive scans, their sensor beams focused not on defensive installations or strategic targets, but on the areas where human cadets were known to be quartered.
This is unprecedented, Professor Thanek said, her crystalline form now pulsing with what might have been academic excitement despite the danger. The Devourers have never shown interest in individual species before. They consume technology and information indiscriminately.
Because no species has ever posed a fundamental threat to their operational philosophy, Marcus said quietly.
But humans fight differently.
We don't follow established patterns, we adapt constantly, and we get better under pressure. Those are exactly the characteristics that made them vulnerable during the final phase of the war.
Admiral Krextor's expression was grim with understanding.
They're here to develop countermeasures. Study human tactics, analyze human psychology, identify weaknesses they can exploit when they launch their next major offensive.
How long before they have what they need? Sarah asked, studying the scanning patterns displayed on the tactical readouts.
Unknown, Kess replied, his tentacles now displaying what humans would recognize as deep concern. But, given their information absorption capabilities, probably not long. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her mind racing through the tactical possibilities with the same speed she had brought to every crisis in her military career. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm certainty that marked her as someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure.
Then, we don't let them finish.
Captain Williams, Krextor said carefully, the Academy's defensive systems are completely outmatched.
We have training weapons, basic shields, and a handful of patrol vessels. The Devourer scouts alone could overwhelm our entire fleet. I'm not suggesting we fight them, Sarah replied. I'm suggesting we teach them.
The statement hung in the air like a physical presence while everyone in the tactical center tried to process what she had just said. Marcus was the first to understand, his eyes widening with a combination of admiration and concern for what his colleague was proposing. You want to give them false intelligence, he said.
Demonstrate fake weaknesses, artificial tactical limitations, make them think they understand human capabilities when they actually don't. Exactly.
Sarah moved to the tactical display, her fingers dancing over the controls to show various Academy training scenarios.
They're expecting to observe authentic human military behavior under stress.
Instead, we give them a carefully crafted performance designed to make them overconfident about their countermeasures.
That's. Commander Kess began, then stopped as he realized the elegance of the proposal. That's actually brilliant. Use their own intelligence gathering against them. Admiral Krextor was studying the tactical display with the focused intensity of a veteran officer evaluating a complex operation. What did you have in mind?
We stage a defensive action, Sarah explained, calling up Academy schematics and overlaying them with potential battle plans.
Make it look like we're trying to protect the human cadets while actually following predictable galactic military doctrine. Use conventional tactics, standard weapon systems, established communication protocols. Give them exactly what they expect to see from any other species. And, meanwhile?
Professor Yathara asked, her hive mind evidently fascinated by the deception strategy. Meanwhile, we prepare for what they'll actually face when they encounter humanity in real combat situations, Marcus continued, picking up his colleague's line of reasoning. Improvised tactics, adaptive strategies, unconventional weapon usage, everything we've been doing here that they won't see in a staged defensive action.
It's a gamble, Krextor observed.
If they see through the deception, we'll have revealed our awareness of their intelligence operations. If we don't try it, they'll get accurate intelligence about human capabilities and use it to develop effective countermeasures, Sarah countered. Either way involves risk, but this approach at least gives us some control over what they learn. The Admiral was quiet for several long moments, his scarred features reflecting the kind of difficult calculation that every military commander eventually faced, choosing between bad options in hopes of achieving the least catastrophic outcome.
How long would you need to prepare this performance?
Give us 2 hours to coordinate with the human cadets and brief selected Academy personnel on their roles, Sarah replied. The beauty of this approach is that most of the Academy's defenders can react authentically because they won't know it's a deception. Only the humans and a few key officers need to be aware of the actual plan.
And if the Devourers detect the deception?
Then, we fall back to conventional defensive tactics and hope the evacuation proceeds quickly enough to save most of the Academy personnel, Marcus said bluntly. But, if we do nothing, they get the intelligence they came for anyway, and humanity loses the element of surprise that's been our greatest advantage. Krextor looked around the tactical center, seeing nods of agreement from faculty members who had spent the past months watching humans revolutionize their understanding of military possibilities. The decision, when it came, was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that marked him as someone who had made similar choices before.
Do it.
You have 2 hours to coordinate your deception. I'll brief the senior staff on their roles and ensure the evacuation continues on schedule. He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes with something that might have been respect mixed with concern. Captain Williams, I hope your species' reputation for achieving impossible victories proves accurate, because what you're proposing is definitely impossible by any conventional measure.
Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal.
Admiral, with respect, conventional measures haven't worked out very well against the Devourers so far. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of careful coordination and deliberate preparation. Sarah and Marcus worked with the dozen other human cadets at the Academy to plan their roles in the deception, while selected faculty members received briefings on how to make the Academy's defense look more conventional and less innovative than their recent training had actually been.
The key was subtlety.
The Devourers were known for their sophisticated intelligence analysis capabilities, which meant the deception had to be believable at multiple levels. The humans couldn't simply pretend to be incompetent, they had to demonstrate exactly the kind of tactical thinking that the Devourers would expect from a species that had achieved the victories humanity was known for, while simultaneously concealing the methods that had actually made those victories possible. Remember, Sarah told the assembled human cadets during their final briefing, you're not pretending to be bad at this. You're pretending to be good at it in exactly the way they expect us to be good at it.
Conventional tactics, standard weapon systems, established communication procedures.
Fight like Veltari or Brutax or any other species would fight, not like humans.
What about innovation under pressure? Asked Cadet Thompson, a wiry young woman from the Europa colonies whose psychological profile showed the same stress enhancement patterns that had become a hallmark of human military performance.
That's been our signature characteristic in every exercise.
That's exactly what we're hiding, Marcus replied.
Today, when the pressure increases, you follow doctrine more rigidly, not less. Make decisions by the book, stick to established protocols, use standard solutions for standard problems. Be everything the galaxy expects from a military species, and nothing that makes us unique.
And if the deception fails? Sarah's expression was serious but determined. Then, we drop the act and fight like humans. But, hopefully, it won't come to that.
At exactly 0547 hours, the Devourer fleet began its approach. The Academy's defensive systems came online with the mechanical precision that marked them as products of galactic engineering, powerful, efficient, and utterly predictable. Patrol vessels took up positions according to standard defensive doctrine while the Academy's shields rose to full power. And, in the tactical center, Admiral Krextor gave the order that would either save humanity's strategic advantage or doom them all to fighting a war where the enemy knew exactly what to expect.
All stations, execute Defensive Plan Alpha 7. Standard Galactic Doctrine, by the book, no improvisation.
Protect the evacuating personnel and buy time for the evacuation ships to reach safe distance.
The battle that followed was unlike any engagement in the Academy's history, precisely because it was so utterly conventional.
The defending forces followed established protocols with textbook precision, their movements predictable and their responses exactly what any trained military analyst would expect. The humans played their roles perfectly. Sarah led a squadron of patrol vessels in a defensive action that demonstrated tactical competence without innovation, using standard galactic fighting techniques with the kind of professional efficiency that marked her as a skilled officer working within established parameters. Marcus coordinated ground-based defenses using conventional weapon systems and traditional defensive strategies, his responses to Devourer probing attacks following galactic military doctrines so precisely that they might have been lifted from Academy textbooks. To any observer, it would have appeared that humanity was exactly what their technology and physiology suggested, a competent but unremarkable addition to galactic military forces, capable of following established doctrine but lacking the innovative spark that had made them legendary. The Devourer response was everything Sarah had hoped for. Their scanning intensified, their intelligence-gathering systems working overtime to catalog and analyze human tactical behavior under actual combat stress. They observed the human defenders reacting to pressure by following doctrine more rigidly rather than less, saw them using standard weapons in standard ways, noted their communication protocols and command structures following patterns identical to those used by dozens of other galactic species. For 3 hours, the deception held. The Academy's defenses fought a skillful but conventional delaying action while evacuation ships carried non-essential personnel to safety. The Devourers gathered exactly the intelligence they had come for, their sensor arrays recording detailed information about human military capabilities under battlefield conditions. And then, something went wrong. Admiral, Commander Cass reported from the sensor station, his tentacles rippling with concern. The Devourer scanning patterns are shifting. They're no longer conducting intelligence gathering. They're targeting evacuation ships. Krextor's expression went grim with understanding. They've got what they came for. Now they're switching to eliminate the evidence. On the tactical display, the Dark Devourer vessels began to move with new purpose. No longer content to observe and analyze, they were positioning themselves to intercept the fleeing evacuation ships. The Academy's defensive forces were already committed to their current positions, unable to respond quickly enough to protect the evacuating civilians. Estimated time before they reach firing range of the evacuation convoy? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the kind of calm that marks someone shifting into crisis mode. 17 minutes, Cass replied. Our current defensive positioning makes it impossible to intercept them in time. Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing the same calculation in his eyes that was running through her own mind. They had successfully deceived the Devourers about human capabilities, but the cost was about to be the lives of 3,000 Academy personnel who couldn't reach safety in time. Orders, Admiral, she asked quietly. Krextor was silent for a long moment, his veteran mind working through options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that no officer ever wanted to make. All ships, break from defensive positions and pursue the Devourer intercept force. Maximum speed, all available weapons. He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes with something that might have been apology mixed with desperate hope. Captain Williams, I'm giving you tactical command. Do whatever you think necessary to save those ships. Sarah's smile was sharp and cold as winter night on Earth. Understood, Admiral. All ships, prepare to engage. And, remember, the performance is over. Time to fight like humans. The next few minutes would determine whether humanity's greatest advantage could overcome the disadvantage of having successfully convinced their enemies that they were ordinary. The evacuation ships accelerated desperately toward the edge of the system, their civilian crews pushing aging engines beyond safe parameters in their race against time. Behind them, the Academy's defensive fleet broke formation and gave chase to the Devourer intercept force, their conventional tactics abandoned in favor of the kind of improvised desperation that marked human warfare at its most effective. But 17 minutes was not very much time to reverse the tactical situation, and the Devourers had a significant head start. As the dark ships closed in on their targets, Sarah began issuing orders that would have sounded insane to any conventional military mind. All ships, dump your plasma reservoirs and switch to kinetic projectiles. Ignore the enemy shields, they're not designed for solid rounds. Attack pattern Charlie 9, but modify it for pursuit rather than defense. Captain, came the confused reply from one of the escort vessels, Charlie 9 is an atmospheric fighter pattern. It won't work in space. It will if we adapt it properly, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that had gotten her through every impossible situation in her career. Trust me, and follow my lead. The next few minutes would prove whether human adaptability could overcome the laws of physics and the advantages of superior numbers. In the tactical center, Admiral Krextor watched the unfolding battle with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing either a brilliant victory or a catastrophic defeat. The only certainty was that it would be uniquely, unmistakably human. The space between Kepler Prime and its outer moons became a three-dimensional chess match played at relativistic speeds, with the lives of 3,000 civilians hanging in the balance. The evacuation convoy pushed their aging engines beyond redline, civilian freighters and passenger vessels, creating improvised formations as they fled toward the system's edge and the safety of hyperspace.
Behind them, the Devourer Intercept Force moved with the mechanical precision that had made them legendary throughout the galaxy.
7 sleek vessels designed for exactly this kind of pursuit, their dark hulls bristling with weapon systems that could vaporize the fleeing ships in seconds once they achieved firing range. And, racing to intercept them both, the Academy's defensive fleet pushed their patrol vessels to maximum velocity while Sarah Williams issued orders that would have gotten any conventional officer court-martialed for tactical insanity. Echo Squadron, drop your plasma reservoirs now and reconfigure for kinetic rounds, she commanded from the bridge of her lead vessel, her fingers dancing over tactical controls with practiced efficiency.
Foxtrot Squadron, I need you to execute a controlled engine burn failure in 30 seconds.
Captain, came the bewildered response from Foxtrot Leader, a Veltari pilot whose species had been perfecting space combat for millennia. A controlled engine failure will leave us dead in space.
Exactly, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of calm confidence that marked someone who saw 3 moves ahead in a game everyone else thought was over. Trust me, Lieutenant. Mark, execute. The Foxtrot Squadron vessels suddenly began tumbling out of formation, their engines sputtering and dying as if mechanical failures had struck simultaneously. To any observer, it would have appeared that 4 ships had just become sitting ducks, helpless targets waiting for enemy fire. But Sarah wasn't thinking like any observer. She was thinking like a human.
Echo Squadron, kinetic rounds loaded and ready, reported the squadron leader, a crystalline Zephyrian whose species had adapted to human tactical innovations with surprising enthusiasm. Target the Devourer formation, but not their ships, Sarah instructed.
I want you to hit the space directly in front of their projected course. Fill that area with as much debris as you can manage.
The orders made no tactical sense by conventional standards. Firing at empty space was a waste of ammunition, and the Devourer vessels were shielded against debris impacts.
But Sarah wasn't following conventional standards.
Firing now, Echo Leader reported, and space in front of the pursuing enemy ships suddenly filled with thousands of kinetic projectiles, creating a dense cloud of fast-moving metal.
The Devourer ships barely noticed, their shields deflecting the projectiles without difficulty as they continued their pursuit.
Their formation remained perfect, their targeting systems already locked onto the fleeing evacuation ships.
Foxtrot Squadron, Sarah called to the apparently disabled vessels, stand by for engine restart. Mark, now.
The disabled patrol ships suddenly roared back to life, but instead of resuming their pursuit course, they accelerated directly toward the debris cloud that Echo Squadron had created. To any conventional tactical analysis, it looked like a desperate and doomed charge at superior forces.
Which was exactly what Sarah wanted it to look like. What is she doing? Admiral Krextor muttered in the tactical center, watching the bizarre engagement unfold on the Academy's displays.
She's sending 4 ships on a suicide run through a debris field.
Commander Kessa's tentacles rippled with what might have been sudden understanding.
Unless, she's not trying to attack the Devourers directly.
She's using the debris cloud as camouflage.
On the tactical display, the 4 patrol ships disappeared into the metal cloud that Echo Squadron had created, vanishing from sensors as the debris interfered with targeting systems. The Devourer formation adjusted slightly to avoid the debris field, but continued their pursuit of the evacuation ships without deviation.
Foxtrot Squadron, report status, Sarah called. We're through the debris field and moving to wait.
The squadron leader's voice carried sudden surprise. Captain, we're directly behind the Devourer formation. Their shields are focused forward for pursuit mode. Perfect, Sarah replied, her smile visible in her voice even over the communications link.
All ships, execute attack pattern Human Alpha. Target their engines, not their weapons. We want to disable, not destroy. What happened next redefines space combat tactics for every species in the galaxy.
The 4 patrol ships emerged from the debris cloud directly behind the Devourer formation, their kinetic weapons firing at point-blank range into unshielded engine nacelles. But, instead of the standard attack patterns that Galactic Doctrine would have prescribed, they moved like pack hunters, coordinating their strikes with an intuition that seemed almost telepathic. The first Devourer ship lost main propulsion as kinetic rounds shredded its engine systems.
The second began spinning out of control as precisely placed shots destroyed its maneuvering thrusters.
The third and fourth ships turned to engage their attackers, but found themselves facing opponents who refused to fight according to any recognized patterns. They're not following standard attack doctrine. The Devourer ships' tactical computers reported to their commanders in the harmonic frequencies that served as their species' battle language. Engagement parameters are outside established response algorithms. Which was when Sarah played her second card. All remaining ships converge on the Devourer formation. But not in attack formation. I want loose groups, overlapping fields of fire, and constant movement. Make it impossible for them to predict your next position. The Academy's remaining patrol vessels abandoned every principle of conventional space combat and began moving like a school of fish or a flock of birds, individual units following simple rules that created complex, unpredictable group behavior. The Devourers found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Target the lead ship, Sarah commanded, but her next words made no tactical sense to anyone who wasn't thinking like a human. I want you to miss. Deliberately. Put your shots close enough to make them dodge, but don't actually hit them. Captain, came the confused response from multiple pilots simultaneously. Trust me, Sarah replied, watching the tactical display with the focused intensity of a chessmaster 3 moves from checkmate. Make them dance. The Academy ships began firing at the Devourer vessels with what appeared to be terrible accuracy, their shots consistently missing by narrow margins that forced the enemy ships to take evasive action. To any conventional analysis, it would have appeared that the Academy pilots were simply poor marksmen working under impossible pressure. But the Devourers were being herded. Each near miss forced them to adjust course slightly, and the accumulated course corrections were driving them away from the evacuation convoy and toward an area of space that looked completely empty on all sensors. The enemy ship's tactical computers noted the pattern but couldn't identify any strategic value in the apparently random region where they were being driven. Captain Williams, came Admiral Craigstore's voice over the command channel, the Devourers are beginning to break off pursuit of the evacuation ships. Whatever you're doing, it's working. We're not done yet, Sarah replied grimly. Foxtrot Squadron, how are your engine systems looking? Operational, but running hot from the burst acceleration through the debris field, came the response. Perfect. I need you to execute a controlled engine explosion. The communications channel went dead silent for several seconds before Foxtrot leader responded with carefully controlled incredulity. Captain, did you just order us to blow up our own engines? Not blow up. Overload them in a specific way that creates a massive electromagnetic pulse. I'm sending you the technical specifications now. Sarah's fingers flew over her tactical controls, uploading detailed instructions that looked like they had been pulled from some kind of advanced physics textbook. You'll need to time it exactly right, or this won't work. Time what exactly right? Foxtrot leader asked, though his voice suggested he was already beginning to understand the scope of what Sarah was planning. The moment when all 7 Devourer ships are within the electromagnetic radius of your overload, she replied. Which should be in approximately 90 seconds if they continue their current evasive pattern. The next minute and a half unfolded with the kind of precise coordination that looked like magic but was actually the result of planning several moves ahead while everyone else was still trying to understand the current situation. The Academy ships continued their apparently inept attacks, driving the Devourer formation closer and closer to the position where Foxtrot Squadron waited with their engines primed for controlled overload. 60 seconds to optimal positioning, Sarah announced over the general frequency. Captain, came a new voice, Marcus, calling from the Academy's ground-based command center where he had been coordinating the evacuation efforts. I've been running calculations on your plan. The electromagnetic pulse will disable the Devourer ships, but it will also knock out every electronic system in a 50-kilometer radius. Including our own ships. I know, Sarah replied calmly. Which is why we're going back to kinetic weapons and manual navigation after the pulse hits. Manual navigation in a space battle? Admiral Craigstore's voice carried the kind of disbelief usually reserved for impossible physical laws. That's never been attempted. The reaction times required are beyond any known species' capabilities. Any known species except humans, Sarah corrected. Our ancestors navigated by dead reckoning for thousands of years before we developed electronic systems. We're very good at estimating distance, direction, and relative motion using nothing but visual references and intuition. 30 seconds to optimal positioning, she announced. The Devourer ships had finally begun to realize that their evasive maneuvers were following a pattern but their tactical computers were unable to identify the strategic purpose behind their positioning. They began attempting to break free of the engagement zone, but found themselves boxed in by Academy ships that seemed to anticipate their every move.
15 seconds. All ships, prepare for electromagnetic shutdown, Sarah commanded.
Switch to manual controls, kinetic weapons only, dead reckoning navigation.
Remember, after the pulse hits, you're flying by sight and intuition. 5 seconds. Foxtrot Squadron, execute.
The 4 patrol ships triggered their engine overload simultaneously, creating an electromagnetic pulse that expanded outward at the speed of light. Every electronic system within 50 kilometers simply stopped working: shields, weapons, navigation computers, communication systems, life support automation, everything that made modern space combat possible. In the sudden electronic silence, 7 Devourer ships found themselves floating helpless, their sophisticated systems reduced to expensive metal sculptures drifting through vacuum. And then, the Academy ships began to move. Without electronic guidance, without computer targeting, without any of the technological advantages that had defined space combat for millennia, human pilots began engaging the disabled Devourer vessels using nothing but visual references and kinetic weapons aimed by hand and eye.
It should have been impossible.
Space combat required split-second timing, precise calculations, and technological assistance that no biological mind could replicate. The distances involved, the velocities, the three-dimensional complexity of orbital mechanics, all of it demanded computer assistance.
But humans had spent millennia as persistence hunters, tracking prey across vast distances using nothing but observation, intuition, and relentless determination.
They had developed spatial reasoning skills that no other species possessed, honed by generations of ancestors who had needed to estimate distance, speed, and trajectory to survive. Target the command ship first, Sarah called over the kinetic communication system they had rigged as backup.
Aim for the weapon hardpoints and disable their offensive capabilities.
The Academy pilots began placing kinetic rounds with impossible accuracy, their shots guided by instincts that 10,000 years of technological advancement had never quite eliminated. They moved their ships like extensions of their own bodies, feeling the gravitational influences and momentum changes that their instruments would have normally calculated for them.
"This is impossible," Admiral Krextor whispered in the tactical center, watching the engagement unfold on backup sensors that provided only basic positional data.
"No species can fight effectively under these conditions." "Humans can," Commander Kess replied, his tentacles rippling with what might have been awe. "They're fighting like their ancestors hunted, by instinct, intuition, and absolute determination." The disabled Devourer ships tried desperately to restart their systems, but the electromagnetic pulse had caused cascading failures throughout their